The farm was bleeding money in silence. Scott Callum stared at the bank notice nailed to his barn door. 14 days until foreclosure. Christmas was a week away. The cattle were starving. The fields lay fallow. He'd lied to get a bride. Now she was coming, and he had nothing but dying land to offer.
Hello, compliments of the season. If you love heartwarming stories about life in times past, then you'd enjoy these stories. Comment where you're watching from, like and share these videos with loved ones as you enjoy them. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel too. My team and I have something free and beautiful for you once we hit the 1,000 subscriber mark. It will be shared in the community. You know, we go to great lengths to make these stories, and your support means a lot to us. Therefore, we plan to give back to you once we are able to. So be a part of what we are building.
The farm was dying in the cold. Scott Callum stood in the frozen yard outside Durango, Colorado, staring at the paper nailed to the barn door. The foreclosure notice flapped in the December wind, its edges already curling from frost. 14 days. That's all the bank had given him. 14 days until everything his father carved from this hard land, everything Scott had bled for, would belong to someone else. Christmas was 1 week away, not that it mattered. The cattle were gaunt, ribs pressing through dull hides like fence posts. The fields lay fallow, brown and brittle under gray sky. The irrigation ditches he dug by hand 2 summers ago sat empty, cracked clay at the bottom. The barn leaned slightly to the east, weathered boards gap-toothed where wind had torn them loose. 2 years, that's how long it took for Colorado to break him. First came the drought that withered his wheat to dust, then the brutal winter that killed half his livestock, then the failed spring planting when the seeds rotted in ground too wet, then too dry, then frozen solid when late snow came in April. He'd made a decision 5 weeks ago, a desperate one, the kind you make when loneliness becomes another debt you can't pay, when silence at the supper table feels louder than anything you can say to yourself. He'd placed an ad in the territorial paper: land, stability, partnership. Hard-working rancher seeks wife, future guaranteed. Simple words for a complicated lie. He hadn't mentioned the rot underneath, hadn't mentioned the bank or the debt, or Vernon Drake circling like a turkey vulture waiting for something to die. Drake owned half of the Animus Valley already, rich, patient, connected. He'd made offers twice, each time with that smile that said he knew exactly how this story ended. Scott had refused both times. Pride, maybe. Stupidity, probably. The stage was due today. Scott walked to the house, boots crunching through frost. Inside, he'd cleaned what he could, swept the floors, washed the windows, hid the worst of the poverty behind closed doors. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. By noon, he was waiting at the edge of town, watching the road. The woman who stepped off the stage wasn't what Scott had imagined. She didn't look like hope or rescue or any of the things he'd let himself picture in weak moments. She looked exhausted. Her coat was patched at the shoulders, her boots worn down at the heels. She carried one trunk herself and didn't wait for the driver or anyone else to help. She set it down and looked at him. "I'm Katie Aaron," she said. Her voice was flat, cautious, no warmth, no expectation. "I suppose you're Scott?" He nodded, stepped forward, took the trunk without a word. It was heavier than it should have been, packed tight with whatever life she'd brought with her. They rode back in silence. Katie sat beside him on the wagon, hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning the horizon. Scott tried to see the farm the way she must be seeing it. The sagging barn, the empty corral, the field stretched out brown and lifeless, the house with its crooked shutters and missing shingles. She didn't say anything, just looked, the way someone looks at a wound before deciding how deep it goes.
When they reached the house, Scott carried her trunk inside. The cabin was clean but bare. He'd done what he could. It wasn't enough. "Thank you," Katie said quietly. Scott nodded and left her alone. That night, he would tell her the truth. Scott waited until after supper to tell her. They sat across from each other at the small table, tin plates between them. He'd cooked what he could: beans, hard bread, coffee that tasted like burnt wood. Katie ate without comment. She hadn't unpacked, hadn't asked questions, just moved through the evening like someone conserving energy for whatever came next. The lamp flickered between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Scott set down his cup. "There's something you need to know," he said. Katie looked at him, waited. "The farm is failing," he said. "Has been for 2 years. Drought took the crops, lost half the herd to winter. Couldn't pay for seed, couldn't fix what broke. The bank gave me until the 30th, 14 days from now. After that, it's foreclosure." He watched her face. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. "There's a man," Scott continued, "Vernon Drake, owns most of the valley already. He's been waiting for this. He'll buy it from the bank for half what it's worth and add it to his empire. He's patient. He knows I'm drowning." Katie's hands wrapped tighter around her cup. "You should have said," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but something sharp lived underneath it. "In the ad, in the letters, you should have told me." "You still might not have," she said, "but at least I'd have known what I was walking into." Scott felt the shame rise in his chest. She was right. He'd lied by omission, brought her here under false pretenses because he was too proud to admit the truth and too desperate to face it alone. "I'm sorry," he said. Katie stood, carried her plate to the basin, and stood there with her back to him. "What were you hoping for?" she asked. "That I'd fix it? That a wife would somehow make the debt disappear?" "I don't know," Scott said. "I wasn't thinking straight." She turned. Her eyes were hard now, no softness left. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "My mother died 6 months ago. The dress shop went to creditors. I had a trunk, $35, and no family. Your ad promised something stable, a partnership. That's what you called it in the letter." Scott remembered writing that word. It had felt true at the time. Now it just felt like another lie. "I meant it," he said. "Did you? Or did you just need someone to witness the end?" The words hit harder than he expected. Maybe because they were true. Maybe he had wanted someone else there when it all finally collapsed. Someone to share the weight of losing. "I don't know what I wanted," he admitted, "but I know what I need. I need to save this place, and I can't do it alone." Katie studied him. The lamplight carved shadows across her face. "I'm not a miracle," she said. "I can work. I'm good with my hands, but I can't save a sinking ship with 14 days and no tools." "I know. Then why am I here?" Scott didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound selfish. Katie sighed. "Sit back down." She waited until he did. "I'll stay through Christmas," she said. "After that, if this place goes under, we figure out what's next, separately or together, but no more lies. If we're doing this, we do it honestly." Scott nodded. "Honest," he said. They sat in silence. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the lamp burned low. Neither of them knew if 14 days was enough time to save anything. But the terms were set. Morning would come early. Scott woke before dawn to find Katie already gone from the small room he'd given her. He pulled on his boots and coat, stepped outside into the cold. The barn door stood open, lamplight spilling into the darkness. He crossed the frozen yard. Inside, Katie stood surrounded by his unsold wool bales, running her hand across the fiber. She dragged out the cotton he'd stored 2 seasons ago, stacked and forgotten. Her trunk sat open nearby, and he could see fabric inside, folded neat and tight. "What are you doing?" he asked. Katie turned. "How much wool do you have?" 8 bales, maybe 9. Couldn't sell it. Price dropped after the railroad made it cheaper to ship from Wyoming. And this cotton? 2 years old, was going to trade it, but everything had fallen apart. Katie knelt by her trunk, lifted out a piece of equipment he didn't recognize at first. Then he saw the treadle, the wheel, the needle arm, a sewing machine. "My mother ran a dress shop in Kansas City," she said. "She trained me from the time I was 7. When the railroad came through, they brought factory-made clothing, cheaper, faster. We couldn't compete. She died trying." Scott watched her assemble the machine with practiced efficiency. "I kept the shop running 2 years after," she continued. "Did everything. Custom dresses, alterations, mending. But a woman running a business alone, people didn't trust it. Didn't matter how good the work was. Eventually, I couldn't pay the rent." She looked up at him. "I noticed something in town yesterday. The Minners, the ranchers, they're all wearing Eastern clothes that don't fit this climate. Thin cotton shirts in December, seams that split after a week of hard work. Scott, Katie, people here need clothes built for Colorado. Double reinforced seams for ranch work, wool linings for winter, designs that actually last." She stood, surveys the wool and cotton like a general surveying troops. "You have raw materials you can't sell. I have skills no one would pay for. Maybe together we have something." Scott headed his head. "We have 14 days. How much can you possibly make?" Katie met his eyes. "Enough to try." She sat down at the machine, threaded the needle, and began to work. The rhythmic sound of the treadle filled the barn. Scott stood there another moment, then went to feed what livestock remained. The sun broke over the mountains, and the sewing machine hummed like something waking up.
Thanks for listening to Scott and Katie's stories so far. If you want to see how they fight their way out of impossible odds, subscribe now. 2 desperate people, 14 days, one last chance. You won't want to miss what happens next. Katie worked through the first day like someone possessed. Scott brought her water, tried to get her to eat. She waved him off, hands moving in constant rhythm. Cut, pin, stitch. The machine never stopped. By evening, she'd finished 3 work shirts, reinforced at the elbows and shoulders, seams double-stitched. "Who are these for?" Scott asked. "Anyone who'll pay," Katie said. The next morning, Jack Holloway rode up. He ranched the adjacent property. Good land, well managed. He'd come looking for Scott about fence repair. He found Katie instead, hanging the finished shirts outside to air. Holloway stopped, picked up one of the shirts, examined the stitching. "Who made this?" "I did," Katie said. He turned it over, tested the seams, checked the reinforcement. "How much?" Katie quoted a price. Holloway paid without haggling, bought 2 on the spot. "I'll mention it to others," he said. Word moved the way it always did in sparse country, slow but certain. A miner's wife came the next day, needed children's clothes that could withstand hard use. A widow from town wanted winter quilts. A teamster brought fabric, asked for custom work pants. Katie charged fair prices, not cheap ones. People paid. Some came back with more work. Scott kept the ledger, wrote down every job, every payment. The numbers climbed. Not fast enough, but climbing. He did the math each night by lamplight, subtracted what they owed from what they'd made. The gap was still too wide. By the 5th day, Katie was working 16-hour stretches. Scott cut patterns for her, delivered finished orders, managed customers. He'd become her assistant without discussing it. The roles had shifted. She was saving the farm. He was helping her do it. Vernon Drake rode up on the 6th day. Scott was carrying wool batting to the barn when he saw the horse, tall, expensive, groomed like a show animal. Drake sat easy in the saddle, hat tilted back, smiling like he'd come to watch something amusing. "Heard you've got a sewing operation running," Drake said. He dismounted, looped the reins over the fence. "Interesting choice." Scott set down the wool. Behind him, Katie's machine kept its steady rhythm. "We're busy,"
Scott said. Drake walked closer, hands in his pockets. He was younger than Scott, cleaner, well-fed. Everything about him said money and patience. "The bank takes this place in 8 days," Drake said. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "I'll buy it after. Save yourself the embarrassment, Callum. Sell to me now. I'll give you enough to start over somewhere else." "We're not selling." Drake's smile widened. "You think a few shirts are going to cover what you owe?" Behind them, Katie's machine went silent. Drake turned, noticing her for the first time. His eyes moved over her, the fabric scraps in her lap, the worn apron, the needle in her hand. "Didn't figure you for a working woman," he said. Katie set down her work deliberately, walked forward until she stood beside Scott. She looked at Drake with the same expression she'd used to evaluate bad fabric. "Didn't figure you for anything useful," she said. Drake's smile faltered, then returned harder. "Cute," he said. He looked at Callum. "You think this changes anything? You're playing for survival." "We don't need your charity," Scott said. "You will," Drake said. He walked back to his horse, swung up into the saddle. 8 days, Callum. Then it's not your choice anymore." He rode off slowly, like a man with all the time in the world. Scott's hands were fists at his sides. Katie touched his arm just once, light. "He's trying to rattle you. Don't let him." Scott breathed, nodded. They went back to work.
By Christmas Eve morning, Scott was running on anger and coffee that tasted like dirt. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the past 3 nights. Every muscle ached. His hands were raw from cutting patterns, knuckles split from cold and friction. The ledger sat open on the table, numbers that refused to add up to salvation. They'd made money, more than he'd thought possible in 10 days. But it wasn't enough. Not even close. The debt was a wall they kept throwing themselves against. Katie sat across from him, steam rising from her own cup. Her face was drawn, shadows deep under her eyes. She'd been working 18-hour days at the machine, barely stopping to eat. Her fingers were bandaged where needles had pierced skin that had gone numb. "We're short," Scott said. He didn't need to say how much. They both knew. "I know." Outside, the wind howled. Tomorrow morning, the bank would come. The law would come. It would all be over. Katie set down her cup. "There's the Christmas market," she said. Scott looked up. "What?" "Colorado Springs. They hold a market on Christmas Eve. Runs until midnight. People come from 3 counties. Miners flush with year-end pay, families buying gifts, ranchers stocking up." She paused. "They buy custom work. Quality goods." Scott shook his head. "That's 60 miles. Through December weather. We need to leave now. And there's a stall fee we can't afford. If we don't go," Katie interrupted, "we lose quiet. At least this way we go down fighting." He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her it was too risky, too desperate. But what do they have left except desperate? "What would you bring?" he asked. Katie stood, walked to the corner of the barn where she'd been stacking finished work. She pulled back a tarp. Underneath were pieces Scott hadn't seen. A wool coat with embroidered collar, detailed and beautiful. Children's Sunday dresses with fine stitching. A quilt made from scraps, patterns that formed something deliberate. Work shirts, yes, but also exhibition pieces. The kind of craftsmanship people stop to admire. "When did you make these?" Scott asked. "Nights," Katie said, "after you went to sleep." He looked at her, at the exhaustion carved into her face, the determination that kept her upright. She'd been working while he slept, building inventory for a gamble she hadn't even mentioned until now. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because you would have told me not to waste time on fancy pieces," Katie said. "You would have said we needed to focus on practical work. And you would have been right. But practical work wasn't going to get us there, Scott. We needed something more." She was right. He would have said exactly that. "If this fails," Scott said slowly, "we lose faster. We'll have nothing left. If we don't try," Katie said, "we lose anyway. At least this way, we control how it ends." Scott looked at the pieces again. They were good. Better than good. The kind of work people would pay premium prices for at a Christmas market where miners had money burning holes in their pockets and wives wanted something special. He nodded. We'll need the wagon. Blankets to wrap everything. Already packed, Katie said. Of course she had. They loaded the wagon by lamplight, working quickly despite the fatigue. Every piece wrapped carefully, secured against the journey. The horses sensed the urgency, stamping and blowing steam into the frozen air. By the time they were ready, it was past 1 a.m. Christmas Eve had arrived. They had 1 day left. Scott climbed onto the wagon seat. Katie sat beside him, the wrapped goods stacked behind them like prayers made solid. He snapped the reins. The wagon rolled forward into the darkness, leaving the dying farm behind. Ahead, 60 miles of frozen Colorado road. Behind, everything they couldn't afford to lose. The road to Colorado Springs cut through mountain passes that turned treacherous after dark. Snow began falling an hour into the journey, thick flakes that obscured the trail. Scott kept the horses moving at a steady pace, not too fast to risk the wagon, not too slow to waste time they didn't have. Katie sat silent beside him, one hand gripping the seat, the other holding a lantern that did little against the darkness. The cold bit through their coats. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that the wind wouldn't steal. 3 hours in, the wagon hit ice on a steep grade. The wheels slid sideways, horses screaming, the whole rig tilting toward the edge. Scott hauled on the reins, shouting commands. Katie threw her weight to the high side. For one terrible moment, Scott felt the wagon tipping, felt everything they'd built about to tumble into the ravine below. Then the wheels caught, held. The horses found purchase and pulled them back onto solid ground. Scott's hand shook on the reins. Katie's face was white in the lantern light. They didn't stop. Couldn't stop. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Colorado Springs. Scott had never been so exhausted. His eyes burned. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. Beside him, Katie swayed in her seat, half asleep but refusing to lie down in the wagon bed. The town was already stirring. Even this early, vendors were setting up along the main street. Canvas canopies stretched between buildings. The smell of roasting meat and pine smoke filled the air. Families moved through the pre-dawn light, bundled against cold, voices carrying in the stillness. Scott drove to the market square. A man with a ledger stood near the entrance, collecting stall fees. Scott paid $5 they desperately needed and received a location assignment. Not prime spot, edge of the market, poor visibility. But it was something. They claimed their space and began unloading. Scott built a display frame from spare lumber while Katie unwrapped the pieces. Their hands were numb, breath misting with every exhale. Around them, other vendors set up elaborate displays. Eastern goods, factory-made items, established businesses with printed signs and professional arrangements. Scott and Katie had rough wood and desperation. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, they were ready. The clothing and quilts sat arranged on makeshift shelves. Functional pieces in front, decorative work elevated to catch the eye. The embroidered coat, the Sunday dresses, the quilted blankets. Everything Katie had poured herself into during those sleepless nights. People began filtering into the market. Families, miners, ranchers. They walked past, some glanced, most didn't stop. An hour passed, then 2. Scott felt the familiar weight of failure settling over him. They'd gambled everything on this. 60 miles through a winter storm, the stall fee, time they didn't have. And people were walking past like their work was invisible. Katie stood quiet beside him, face unreadable. But Scott saw her bandaged fingers tighten around the edge of the display table. A miner stopped, looked at a work shirt, picked it up, examined the stitching, set it back down. Walked away. 3 hours in, they'd sold nothing. Scott did the math in his head. At this rate, they'd go home empty-handed. The bank would foreclose tomorrow. Vernon Drake would buy the farm for pennies. Everything would be gone. Beside him, Katie stood perfectly still, not defeated, just waiting, like she'd learned long ago that panic solved nothing. Maybe we should lower the prices, Scott said quietly. No, Katie said. The work is worth what I'm asking. If they don't see that, lowering the price won't change their minds. Her voice was steady, certain. Scott didn't know where she found that certainty, but he held onto it like a lifeline. The morning stretched on, the market filled with people. And still, no one stopped at their stall for more than a glance. Then everything changed. Scott and Katie risked everything on one desperate gamble, and right now, it's failing. Will their last stand save the farm, or will they lose everything by sunset? Subscribe now to find out how this impossible day ends. You've come this far with them. Don't miss what happens next. Vernon Drake appeared just before noon. Scott saw him first, that expensive horse, that confident posture. Drake dismounted near the center of the market, and beside him walked a woman in fine Eastern clothing, fur collar, tailored coat. His wife, visiting from Denver. They moved through the crowd like royalty inspecting peasants. Drake's eyes scanned the stalls until they landed on Scott and Katie. His smile widened. He walked over, his wife on his arm, stopped directly in front of their display. "Callum," Drake said pleasantly, "didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd be home preparing for tomorrow's inevitability." Scott's jaw tightened. Katie's hand touched his arm. A warning. Drake's wife picked up the embroidered coat, examined it with the critical eye of someone accustomed to quality. "Frontier craftsmanship," she said, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "How quaint." She set it down like it carried disease. "Homespun goods have their charm," Drake said, projecting his voice, "though I'm not sure they belong at a proper market." He looked at Scott. "This is what you're betting on? This is your salvation?" People nearby slowed, watching. Some moved away from the stall, as if Drake's disdain was contagious. Scott felt the old anger rising, the kind that made him want to swing first. But Katie stepped forward, placing herself between Scott and Drake. "We're not betting on anything," she said. "We're offering quality work to people who recognize it." Drake's smile turned cold. "Quality? Yes. I'm sure the miners and ranchers will appreciate your artistry." He turned to leave, dismissing them entirely. That's when Clara Jennings stopped. She was a mine foreman's wife, weathered and practical, the kind of woman who stretched every dollar until it screamed. She'd been walking past, but paused when she heard Drake's comments. Now, she picked up one of the work shirts, the kind Katie had reinforced with double stitching. She examined the elbows, tested the seams, checked the collar design, spread wide to block wind, reinforced where it would rub against the coat. "Who made this?" she asked. "I did," Katie said. Clara looked at her, back at the shirt. She held it up to the light, studying the craftsmanship. Then she turned to the small crowd that had gathered. "This," she said loudly, "is what my husband needs in the mines. Not that Eastern foolishness that splits after one shift." She pointed at the reinforced elbows. "Look at this. Double-stitched, built for actual work. And this collar," she demonstrated how it would protect against Colorado wind. "This is someone who understands what we need out here." A woman in the crowd stepped closer, picked up another shirt. "My son works the rail line," she said. "Goes through 3 shirts a season with regular ones." "Because regular ones aren't built for this," Clara said. She looked at Katie. "How much?" Katie quoted her price. The same price Drake had just implied was ridiculous. Clara paid without hesitation. "I'll take 3, and I'll tell every woman at the mining camp about this." The shift happened like a dam breaking. Other miners' wives pressed forward, asking questions, examining pieces. A rancher's wife picked up the embroidered coat, the one Drake's wife had dismissed, and held it against herself. "This is beautiful," she said. "And look at these seams. This will last years." Word moved through the market like wildfire. People who'd walked past now circled back. Katie's hands never stopped moving, wrapping purchases, making change, writing down custom orders. A mercantile owner from Pueblo wanted door hardware. No, wait, he was looking at the wrong stall. But he stopped anyway, interested in the quilts. "Can you make more of these?" "I'll buy 10. Scott handled the money, kept track of sales, his mind calculating constantly. The numbers were climbing, actually climbing. Vernon Drake stood 20 feet away, watching. The smile was gone. His wife tugged at his arm, but he didn't move. Just watched as their stall became the busiest in the market. A wealthy rancher approached, holding the embroidered coat. "Who designed this?" he asked. Scott opened his mouth. The old deflections sat on his tongue. But he looked at Katie, her bandaged hands, her exhausted face, everything she'd given. She did, Scott said, his voice carrying. Katie designed every piece here. She's a master seamstress. This farm stands because of her skill. Katie's head turned. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Validation. The rancher nodded, impressed. I'll take this. And I want to commission 3 more. The sales continued. By mid-afternoon, half their inventory was gone. By dusk, the shelves were empty. The lockbox was full. Custom orders filled Scott's ledger. Weeks of guaranteed income. Katie counted the money, hands shaking. Looked at Scott. It's enough, she said. They drove through the night, neither willing to stop. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ground. Stars scattered overhead like thrown silver. Scott held the reins loose, letting the horses set their own pace. Beside him, Katie sat wrapped in a blanket, the lockbox on her lap. She hadn't let it out of her sight since they'd left Colorado Springs. Neither of them slept. Too much adrenaline. Too much fear that if they stopped moving, something would go wrong. That the money would disappear. That the bank would foreclose early. That Drake would find some way to take it all. They reached the farm as dawn broke on Christmas morning. The house looked the same, weathered, sagging, half-broken. But something felt different. Maybe it was them. Maybe survival changed how you saw things. Scott unhitched the horses while Katie carried the lockbox inside. When he entered, she had the money spread on the table, counting it a 3rd time. Making sure it's all here, she said. Every dollar. Scott sat down heavily. His body ached in ways he'd forgotten were possible, but the ache felt earned now. Honest. The bank opens at 9, he said. I know. They sat in silence as the light grew. Outside, the farm woke slowly, cattle lowing, wind moving through broken boards, the familiar sounds of a place that refused to die. At 8:30, they rode into town. The bank was a square brick building that had always felt like a courthouse to Scott. A place of judgment. He and Katie walked in together, the lockbox between them. The banker, Howard Strickland, looked up from his desk. Surprise crossed his face when he saw them. Mr. Callum, he said, I wasn't expecting you until later. We're here to settle the debt, Scott said. Strickland's eyebrows rose. He glanced at Katie, then back to Scott. The full amount? The full amount. Vernon Drake sat in a chair by the window. He'd arranged to be present, expecting to witness Scott's failure, to make his final offer when Scott had nothing left. Now he stood slowly, watching as they approached Strickland's desk. They counted it out. Every bill, every coin. Strickland verified it twice, his expression shifting from doubt to something like respect. Drake moved closer, silent, his face unreadable. When Strickland was satisfied, he pulled out the paperwork. This clears your debt in full, he said. He stamped the documents, signed them, slid them across the desk. The farm is yours, free and clear. Scott took the papers. They felt heavier than they should have, lighter than he'd feared. Drake stood there another moment, then walked to the door. He paused, looked back. Enjoy your small victory, Callum, he said. His voice was cold. Winter's long in Colorado. Then he was gone. Outside, Katie stopped on the boardwalk. That's it? She asked. That's it. She nodded slowly. Something released in her shoulders. Tension she'd been holding for weeks, maybe longer. They rode back in silence. When they reached the farm, Scott walked to the barn and tore down the foreclosure notice. The nails came out easy. The paper crumpled in his fist. He threw it into the fire pit where Katie had first set up her sewing machine. Inside the cabin, they made coffee. Real coffee this time, not the burnt substitute Scott had been stretching. They sat at the table with the papers between them. Proof of ownership. Proof of survival. What now? Katie asked. Scott looked at her. At this woman who'd arrived 2 weeks ago, expecting stability, and found ruins instead. Who'd worked until her hands bled. Who'd gambled everything on a Christmas market because quiet defeat wasn't acceptable. Now we work, he said. You've got orders to fill. The farm needs repairs. Spring will bring planting season if we can afford seed. It won't be easy. It hasn't been easy, Katie said. No, Scott agreed. It hasn't. She smiled. The first real smile he'd seen from her. It changed her face completely. Good, she said. Easy doesn't build anything worth keeping. They drank their coffee. Outside, the barn stood ready. The farm stretched out around them, damaged but standing. The debt was gone, but the labor remained. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was a beginning built on truth. Winter settled in after Christmas, slow and deliberate. The farm didn't transform overnight. The fences still sagged. The barn roof still leaked when it snowed. The irrigation ditches needed clearing. But the work felt different now. Not desperate scrambling against collapse, but deliberate building towards something that might last. Katie kept her sewing machine running. Orders came in steadily, carried by word that spread through the county like roots finding water. She made work clothes, custom pieces, repaired what people brought. Scott worked beside her when he could, cutting patterns, delivering finished orders, keeping the books. The rest of the time, he mended what was broken, fixed the well pump, shored up fence posts, cleared snow from the fields. They worked hard, slept hard, spoke when words were needed. The mercantile order came through. Custom tablecloths that took Katie 2 weeks to complete. The mining company sent payment up front for work uniforms, then doubled the order. A rancher 2 counties overcommissioned winter coats for his hands. The money came in, not floods but steady. Enough to buy seed, enough to pay for lumber, enough to breathe. Vernon Drake rode by once more in late January. He sat on his horse at the property line, looking at the smoke rising from the chimney, at Scott working on the fence. He didn't say anything, just sat there for a long moment, then turned his horse and rode away. He didn't come back. By February, the farm had settled into rhythm. Katie worked 5 days a week, taking custom orders and building inventory. Scott ran the ranch, the cattle, the land, the infrastructure that held it all together. They ate together, planned together, divided labor according to skill instead of assumption. They didn't marry right away. There was too much work, too much exhaustion, too much history of desperation that needed time to settle into something honest. But something grew anyway, quiet, rooted in shared exhaustion and mutual respect. In a way, Katie left coffee for him before dawn. In the way Scott prepared her workspace without being asked. In conversations that moved past survival into possibility. Spring came slowly. The grass returned green and new. Scott planted wheat in fields that had lain fallow for 2 years. 3 calves were born. Katie took on an apprentice, a young woman from town who wanted to learn the trade. The sewing operation expanded. A new room added to the barn to house additional equipment. In late April, they stood together at the property line, looking out over land that had almost been lost. "It's not what you advertised," Katie said. Scott looked at her. "No, you promised land, a roof, and a future," she said. "The land's still recovering. The roof still leaks. And the future's still uncertain." "I know," Scott said. "I am sorry." Katie smiled. "I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's different than expected." "Is that bad?" "No," she said. "It's honest." They stood quiet, watching the wind move through new grass. "We should probably make it official," Scott said. "The ranch. Us." Katie turned to look at him fully. "Is that a proposal?" "If you want it to be." She laughed, a sound he'd come to recognize as rare and valuable. "Not your best work, Callum." "No," he admitted. "It's not." "I'll take it anyway," she said. They married in June, in front of witnesses who knew what they'd survived. No grand ceremony, no pretense. Just 2 people who'd chosen partnership over pride, work over fantasy. Music played that evening. People danced in the yard where foreclosure notices had once hung. Scott and Katie stood together, watching. The farm spread out around them, damaged but healing, broken but standing. Built not on luck or rescue, but on labor and honesty and the quiet strength of 2 people who refused to quit. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. Thanks for listening to Scott and Katie's story. If you love tales of grit, survival, and second chances built on honest work instead of fairy tale endings, subscribe now. More stories of people who refuse to quit are coming your way. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next one.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it.